Order. Welcome to this hearing of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where we are concluding our inquiry on the Middle East and North Africa. This morning we are very grateful to have Lord Ahmad of Wimbledon and Stephen Hickey hearing for us. We're going to try and cover the whole of the Middle East and North Africa this morning, so there will be quite a bit to get through, but I am delighted that the Foreign Secretary has also confirmed that he's going to come before this committee in very early June, so we look forward to receiving him then. To kick us off, Minister, do you believe the UK is a force for good in the Middle East and North Africa?
The short answer is yes, and I will tell you why. I think one of the things I've learned over many years at the Foreign Office as a joint minister across DFID and the Foreign Office, and then as a merged minister in the new department, is relationships matter. You need to invest in relationships. And certainly both on a personal and professional basis, I've seen the benefit of that, whether it's in terms of responses to humanitarian crisis. In recent times we've seen, for example, the Libyan flooding or indeed the Moroccan earthquake, or of course with something we're all seized of currently, which is the awful and continuing conflict in the Middle East, from those abhorrent events on the 7th of October to the current crisis in Gaza. People want the United Kingdom at the table, and the intensity of diplomacy I've seen certainly over the last 7-8 months is something I haven't experienced before in almost 7 years at the Foreign Office.
Thank you. And you're absolutely right when you make that point about relationships. This committee, and I will say before your time as Minister for the Middle East, have been very critical about what we saw as a deprioritisation of the Middle East and North Africa by the Foreign Office. Both in the integrated review and the integrated review refresh, we saw the tilt to the Indo-Pacific to be a tilt from the Middle East and North Africa. We were particularly concerned that there was no mention of the Palestine-Israel conflict and the situation of Palestine in either document. Has there been a period of reflection since the appalling atrocities of October 7th on that situation and how it may have damaged our reputation in the region?
I think going back to 2021 with the original integrated review, there was reference made to the importance of the Middle East. I accept I'm also the Minister for India, South Asia, etc. So I think it was right that we put in focus into the Indo-Pacific. We've seen benefits on that from the strategic dialogue status we have within ASEAN, this CPTPP and others. And we're of course pursuing an FTA, as you know, with India. And I think those have lent in. The AUKUS deal was another good example of that. So it was right with some of the challenges we face in the Indo-Pacific, there was a focus on that. But I would add, having been a long-standing minister, for example, in the multilateral sphere, that we've continued to provide focus on those UN-mandated, where we're pen holders across the Middle East, North Africa, but equally on the issue of the Middle East peace process. I agree. I think the world had also stood back before the tragic, abhorrent events of 7th of October. I know when I took on the brief of the Middle East 2 years ago, it was one of my singled out priorities. I think there were people probably thinking, what's Tariq going on about within the Foreign Office? But to me, it's one of those intractable problems, and perhaps with the tragedy that now confronts us, we are seized with this as a priority. In terms of prioritisation, of course, we can reflect on the two documents. I think they're broad-ranging, but there was reference made about the importance of the rights of Palestinians and the rights of Israelis. And I'm of a firm belief that until we secure the rights, justice, equality for both Palestinians and Israelis, we will continue to return this issue time and time again.
And forgive me, though, because it wasn't just within the Foreign Office, and I will say I don't think Parliament was in the same place as the Foreign Office and State Department. Also, had Jake Sullivan give an interview only a few days before October 7th saying the Middle East has never been so peaceful, and yet you have parliamentarians in this place saying we are gravely concerned about the situation across a multitude of countries. Obviously I said that we were going to see the Gaza crisis 2023. Now, I didn't expect it to happen as it did. But why do you think the Foreign Office institutionally and the State Department was in a place that was clearly so far from the reality on the ground?
I think I wouldn't say they were removed from it. I think we all want peace in the Middle East. And I think what we were seeing was a period of relative calm compared to previous situations that had arisen. But let's not forget, we've been here before. We've seen the Gaza war break out before. But the severity of where we are now is not something which has been seen in recent times, and nor had we seen the abhorrence of the attacks that we saw on the 7th of October, the biggest attack on Israel since arguably the challenges that it faced in 73 and 67. So there is a refocus, absolutely, and rightly so on this. But at the same time, I would say that the focus on ensuring long-term stability and security from the projects we continue to do in the West Bank the support, obviously, with Hamas's takeover in Gaza. I remember it very well because I was in Israel about to travel to Gaza the day Hamas took over the borders in Gaza. And there was a real sense of, should I go, should I not go? And the reason I didn't go into Gaza on that occasion was because Israel then responded with missile attacks, which were happening. But one thing I'd just say, and we will go on to this, I'm sure, reflecting back on the events, it wasn't, you talked about the State Department or the Foreign Office. When you look at what happened in Israel, and I've been speaking to many Israelis, commentators, friends, ex-leaders of Israel, one thing is very clear. It was a very rudimentary and basic attack. The worst kind of atrocities were committed by guys on the back of pickup trucks and knives and guns. And whilst the missiles and Hamas have that capacity, this was a very crude attack. And it was very indiscriminate. And one final point I'd also just make in reflections on this. When I travelled to Israel after the attacks, I met with Mansour Abbas, who's leader of the Palestinian Arab Party. And he was the one who said to me that, Minister, there were at least 26 people who were killed in those attacks at that music festival who were Muslim. There were a great number who were also killed who were Christian. And we should not lose sight of the fact that Israel is actually 22% Christian, Arab and Muslim. And that's an important point I've certainly made to Israeli leaders, that as we move forward to try and establish justice and security and stability, it's not just about the Palestinian territories, it's also about Green Line Israel as well.
Thank you, and I'm sure we'll come back to that shortly. Fabian.
Yes, the last time I went to Gaza, actually, not only were our passports inspected by the Israeli and Palestinian Authority guards, but they were also inspected by Hamas as well before we were allowed admission there. Can I move us on to Iran's influence in the MENA region? Because I wondered whether you'd seen any evolution in the relationship between the Iranian regime itself and its proxies and affiliates since the October 7th attacks.
Well, I think one thing we've been very clear on is Iran's growing influence across proxies. I would say from what I've seen, particularly in the crisis since the 7th of October, the command and control structure, it's not that Hamas or Hezbollah or anyone else is waiting for a green light, the Houthis, for example, from Tehran. There's a clear link with the supply of weapons. The United Kingdom, along with others, has been engaged on curbing that supply of weapons from Iran. Again, not state, it's often smugglers who are bringing those, as they did to the Houthis. But there is a clear link because these groups are supplied from somewhere. And that supply also, when it comes to armament, particularly as we've seen with the Houthis in Yemen, comes from Iran. So the malign influence of Iran is very clear. Iran also presents a challenge to us in terms of cyber challenges, which we've seen quite clearly. And also, frankly speaking, right here in the UK, including in our parliament and elsewhere, we've seen the challenges directly of Iran's much more assertive way it's acting through attacks directly on UK soil. Therefore, it's right, I think, since over the last few years, there's close to about 400 sanctions in various entities that we've imposed on Iran and individuals. And also, when we were, of course, and remained committed to the JCPOA when the Americans walked away. And there was good reason, and I put it on record, it was far from a perfect treaty. It ignored ballistic missiles, for example, was not included. But it was our view, it was a way of trying to at least ensure that Iran did not develop its nuclear capacity and capabilities. But what is very clear through its non-cooperation with Mr. Grossi and other members of the IAEA, Iran has developed its capacity and its enrichment. And therefore we've got to be very clear of the threat that Iran poses, not just through proxies, as we've seen particularly in the Middle East, but also directly through its actions. And I think the strength of what we do now in the Middle East in terms of security and stability, not just in terms of Israel and the Palestinians, but also the broader security for the wider Gulf, is an important part of how we move forward in actually challenging Iran in the region.
And yet we haven't proscribed the IRGC. What are the arguments in favour of proscription and what are the arguments against?
Well, I think as we examined, it's very easy, and all of you are well experienced in this, to say, oh yes, it's something, it's a tool. And I think the Foreign Secretary summed it up rather well when David Cameron was talking about the issues, and perhaps we'll come on to that. He's had quite extensive engagement with the Iranian foreign minister when Iran launched its attack on Israel. one of the things we had the capacity to do, which the Americans did not, was literally pick up the phone directly and challenge the Iranian foreign minister and land those points. And I think that is coming back to a point that the chair raised about strength of British diplomacy, is our ability to talk to our foes when it really matters in a direct way, and to be able to do so in that manner. As you'll be aware, I think in all, when it comes to the IRGC, we've sanctioned the IRGC in entirety. The numbers of sanctions we put on particular individuals. But the difference between IRGC specific is, of course, you all recognise it as a particular arm of the state. And across both the Home Office and the Foreign Office, there is that agreement that on balance, what we've done so far is the right approach. It also allows us to have that leverage quite directly on the Iranian regime in terms of our direct engagement with them.
You mentioned earlier, Minister, engagement over JCPOA and Iran's nuclear enrichment programme. What sort of issues, apart from that, do you think the UK can engage with Iran on, given that we have that diplomatic connection and that ability to do so? And also, should we focus on engaging with the representatives, such as they are, of the Iranian people, the protest movement over Mahsa Amini, rather than the regime? Are we doing that at all? Is there any way of actually doing that? Because clearly these are organisations that are suppressed by the state.
I think when I use the term engagement, is to actually land these issues, which are pretty hard-edged in terms of diplomacy when it comes to the situation, first and foremost, as we're talking currently, the situation in the Middle East, the use of Iran and its proxies and what it does, the ability to land diplomatic and hard-edged messages as we did after the attacks on Israel. But taking your point, I mean, all of us, it was heart-wrenching, it was gut-churning when the attack on Mahsa Amini, and it wasn't isolated, of course. I recall around that time there was also, you may remember, Fabian, there was a young Olympian, Iranian.
Yes, I do.
And it did bring, I'm a parent of 3 children, it brings a tear to your eye. Here was someone who had actually brought glory to the Iranian nation, and he was put to a death sentence over the burning of, from what I recall, a hut. So I think it allows us, yes, both in multilateral fora, to land these messages extremely strongly. We led, along with the Americans, their expulsion from FCDO after the Mahsa Amini. Why should they be represented on an organisation in the multilateral fora which represents the rights of women, when they can do that for someone? And who, frankly, and excuse my language, who in the hell are the Iranian regime to tell a woman how to dress? Get out of their wardrobes. Even in Islam, and I speak as a Muslim, if I may, for a moment, Islam says la ikrah fi din in Arabic, which means there is no compulsion in religion. These mullahs in Iran, in Tehran, need to be very clear that it is a woman's choice to dress, whether she wears a hijab and niqab or not so. And it's about time the Iranian regime recognises that they're a very rich culture, Iran. I remember years ago, as a young child, travelling through Tehran, and the richness of its food, its culture, its music, its poetry. And I think there is a real recognition, and through civil society engagement that we have, through groups that we have, we're not trying to engage or call for a regime change. The regime itself needs to recognise that its first responsibility is its security and welfare of its citizens. And I think it allows us again to land those very hard messages, not just to Iran directly, but to those who support Iran. As well. We want to see a progressive, inclusive Iran playing its part in Middle East stability and security. And we'll continue to land those messages both through its allies that it has in the region, but most importantly directly when it comes to issues of security.
You speak for all of us in saying that. Indeed, my late mother's many friends were Jews from Iran who'd left and came to the UK. Thank you, Chair.
Can I ask you, Minister, just before we move on briefly, for a long time I've had concerns that the way we deal with Iran is so compartmentalised. We have the part of the Foreign Office that's dealing with the femicide, when we've got a different part dealing with nuclear ambitions, then we've got the Home Office dealing with transnational oppression, we've got proxies, we've got their support for the AQ. How are we making sure that we have a comprehensive response with Iran? Because again, when I look for international leadership on this issue, it does seem to be lacking when actually so many of the causes of the issues that we see within the Middle East go back to Iran in some way. How are we making sure that, yes, although peace in the Middle East and securing a state for Palestine would take a lot of the wind out of Iran's sails, but actually the problem of the Iranian regime and its threshold for chaos is still too high. So what are we doing to tackle that threshold and make sure we don't compartmentalise the issues?
I'll ask Stephen in a moment to come in on how we work across government as well. But of course we have a very close relationship with other departments, the Home Office, which we've already referenced in part, the Ministry of Defence in terms of our capabilities, how we've again tried to look at their malign influence. More recently, for example, I referred earlier about the supply routes from Iran in terms of weapons which are coming through. The United Kingdom operates with other key partners on that. But we've also started extending, as we did in the MOD last year, in calling in some of the other key ambassadors from the Gulf states, other key partners, to actually realise full on what kind of weapons, what kind of things are being seized in terms of that smuggling. And I think it's right that we bring that to the attention of other key partners, and that can't be achieved if we didn't have that strength of coordination, both with our international partners, but also within particularly close workings between the FCDO and the MOD. But with your permission, I don't know, Stephen, if you want to talk.
Yes, I may just briefly add. I mean, first, I completely agree with you that the FCDO needs to work very closely and in a collaborative way with other Whitehall departments, given the threat and the complexity of the threat that Iran poses. I think how the Foreign Office works on Iran has completely transformed over the last 10 years. I used to work in the Iran unit back in 2006, and now I've returned 18 years later, and there are many things that are very different in how we work in a more integrated fashion. First of all, we have a cross-HMG unit based in the Foreign Office that includes people on secondment from other government departments. Second, I'm struck by the fact that the NSC regularly convenes to bring together different ministers on Iran, as does NSCO, and there are also regular JIC discussions. And I think that infrastructure has helped us have more of a collaborative approach to Iran and also a more comprehensive one, taking in the very varied nature of the threat that Iran poses.
Well, then maybe perhaps I could urge that government could do more to engage parliamentarians on the issue of Iran, because I think this is a very pressing concern for us. And from the outside, also we have to recognise cross-Whitehall units may sit within the Foreign Office, but sometimes they themselves become siloed from their home departments while working. I speak from personal experience. Bob?
I just thank you, Chair. I just want to follow up that point. I mean, I have to say, I do, and I get to see government from the outside, but I'm slightly struck that although there's a lot of talk about cross-department cooperation, the sort of integration of government departments, it doesn't always seem to function as well as it could. And when you're making, and we see it most of all with China policy, but I do feel that there are problems also with Russia and Iran, despite the fact that you claim that it's joined up.
Yeah, if I may, I've seen most of my life in public service since I joined, and being a member of the government now for 14 years. So I agree. I think sometimes there's frustrations when you need dynamism and real agility in decision making. There have been moments in my ministerial career where I've grown when we've said, we've got to go on right round, because the ability to be as agile as we can. But I think there has been improvements. Over times, I think at ministerial level, having focused cabinet committees, for example, which bring together the different strands of government working at the top when it comes to key policy decisions that need to be taken, I think is a good way to move forward. But equally, coming back to the point that Chair also made about briefings with parliamentarians, when you're living it, it's very easy to just accept that that's the way it is. But perhaps others do not know, and that's a real reality. And I think we do need to improve in terms of pointed briefings that we can make on what we're doing. The recent experience, just to draw a comparison with Ukraine, I think we sort of briefed out to the nth degree on every element of government policy. We used to ask with parliamentarians, do we want a defence focus? Do we need a military focus, a community focus, a civil society focus on a particular issue, in this case Ukraine? And we were then able to provide quite pointed briefings. And I think certainly we can improve in that direction quite clearly.
So what else would you do, Minister?
Well, I mean, that I've just alluded to one element on this, where I think we can have quite specific and much more periodic-based briefings when analysis is done, for example, assessments are made, and once those decisions are public, sometimes it's appropriate to do so publicly, but I think private briefings with, for example, the Foreign Affairs Committee, with the IDC. I was speaking to a team only yesterday on looking at atrocity prevention, and that was exactly the question. When we do a review, say once a quarter, that is the time to call in the FAC or members of the FAC, of the IDC, our Lords International Committee as well, to give quite specific briefings so there can be better context. And if I may, I've been before you before talking about Afghanistan. One lesson learned from that more than anything was the ability to pick up a phone and provide key members within Parliament in both houses context, so that the questions, the debates that we have on the floor of both houses are informed, and I think that's something we need to improve on.
Moving to Gaza, Minister, have we been able to achieve the UK's objectives when it comes to the Gaza crisis, and if not, why not?
Well, here we are 7 months on, and Chair, this has been on my, not just my agenda, but it's been dominating every facet of my life. I've never engaged so intensively on an issue, because this matters. It matters to the 1,200 people, innocent lives that were lost in Israel through those abhorrent terror attacks, and it matters to the tens of thousands, a third of which are women and children who have lost their lives, who have been killed in Gaza. Therefore, the short answer is, the fact is, the conflict continues, and our number one objective is to bring that conflict to a close. So I'm being very candid with you. I think we need to make sure we do even more in that respect, because that objective has not been achieved. The conflict continues. On the humanitarian side, which was specific to your question, have things improved? Let's go back to the 6th of October. Gaza was very much on the brink then, in terms of the reports I was reading from visits that were made, that there was a really desperate situation in Gaza. And that was when hospitals were functioning, people were going to work, livelihoods were continuing. And let's not forget the intellectual base. The actual educational base of Gaza was very high. A lot of people went to school. What they didn't have was employment opportunities. I remember visiting Israel after the new government was formed. I was the first minister in literally a few days later, and talking to their trade and industry minister, Minister Barak, and I said, forget for a moment that about Israel-Palestine. You've got to provide a horizon of hope to young people in Gaza. And he's a technology expert, and I said, now's the time to use your technology expertise to give scholarships to 1,000 young students. We did a lot of incubation of businesses in Israel and Palestine, and how those could be utilized, because you've got to have that prosperity outlook. And where we are today, fast forward, we have a desperate situation. The IFP have made very clear that we're on the brink of famine. We've seen some relief coming in through Rafah, but let's also be clear. Many of you would have visited the borders. Rafah was a pedestrian crossing. It had a single lane. Why we pressed on Karim Shalom was because that had 6 lanes. It was state-of-the-art. Currently, with the Israeli operations in Rafah, which thankfully, as I speak now, although things move very dynamically, haven't been with the intensity we saw in Khan Yunis or Gaza City, but they have stopped the Rafah crossing. The Rafah crossing was where fuel was getting in. Fuel was what's needed for hospitals. There's a belt of hospitals is a southern part of Rafah, including the European hospital, that's really down to its last tank of fuel. So I think, in short, whilst we've seen some improvements forward in certain routes opening up, the fact is this 500 trucks came from UN sources. That's not some grand target. It's the lowest possible threshold to avert famine. So our ambition needs to be higher. So again, on the humanitarian, whilst we've been plugging away, and we're right that we want the fighting to stop, we want aid to go in, we've been working with partners from the maritime to the airdrops. It's the land routes which make the difference. Yes, we welcome the opening of the Erez crossing, but that Erez crossing, as you will know, and perhaps you have followed as well, it was shocking to see again trucks going in from Jordan through Erez, where again attacked in Israel. And I think we need to not just call these things out, but we need to be focused on how we can really make this work. And one final point, if I may, and is that there are many in Israel. I've met repeatedly, and perhaps we'll come on to that, with hostage families. And I'm not saying I've met all of them, but with the ones that I've met, and I can say to you, Chair, to the members of the committee, there's not one person after that initial shock who said to me, Tariq, Minister, what's happening right in Gaza, the loss of life, the tragic killing of so many children is something that we endorse. They want an end to it. They want their loved ones to be returned, even those who are deceased, so they can bring closure. And we've got to make sure we get that fighting stopped and more aid in. But that 500, I say again, is a minimum threshold to avert famine across Gaza.
Thank you, Ms. We're going to take you back. Brendan and I both want to go more into the humanitarian aid situation, but just briefly on the hostages. Obviously, one of the greatest cruelties is the absolute silence that those families of those being held hostage still have, and they don't know if their loved ones are alive. So what proof of life evidence do we have for all hostages, but particularly those with links to the UK? And what are we doing, frankly, to demand that those who have influence over Hamas, be it Qatar, be it Egypt and Turkey, who may be playing productive roles elsewhere within the process, what are we doing to demand that they give us proof of life for all those families who are sat there in desperate agony, not knowing if their loved ones are alive or dead, or if their hope is misplaced?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We need to ensure that this suffering comes to an end. When you sit with the hostage families, or you sit from, and I've also sat with Palestinian families who fled Gaza, who've had people killed. It's tragic beyond belief. There's a human element. I come back to what I said right at the start. And we need to ensure that first we're giving that support, that they know there's accessibility. And in that regard, you know, I've sat in meetings with the Prime Minister, I've sat in meetings with the Foreign Secretary and directly, and we have been engaging consistently. We've also ensured that the hostage families also have FaceTime with those doing negotiations without going into too much detail of that. The United Kingdom, I talked earlier about relationships and diplomacy. We've helped to provide that bridge. So hostage families have been able to meet and understand what negotiators, but importantly...
Forgive me, why haven't we received proof of life?
I think the challenge is also from those who are holding the hostages is a terrorist organisation. I think they leverage this in a way which causes greater grief and the maximum level of grief. We've seen that. We're looking into that with the tragic case of Mr. Popperwell. I mean, you know, this is how Hamas, a terrorist organisation, exploit the suffering of people. So I assure you, Chair, and indeed the committee, not just of best endeavours, but we are landing these pretty direct messages to those who have influence. And you know where I stand. I've talked to you about this before as well. I do think Qatar continue to play an important role, but equally, you mentioned Turkey, they also have an important role. Because Hamas have an option here. Fighting to the nth degree will not achieve their aims. They could do an easy option. They can put down their arms and come to the negotiation table, release the hostages, and then we have the leverage to be able to try and bring that horizon for peace into a reality. But at the moment, the issue of proof of life, of course we demand it. It needs to happen. But the people who are holding the hostages have a different value criteria than one that you and I would deploy.
Thank you. Bob, then Brendan.
Just very briefly, because I know we're up against time. You mentioned Turkey here. What is Turkey's role? And do you find Erdogan within this context to be useful, or someone who continues to be quite challenging to deal with sometimes?
I think the starting point on that is Turkey have a diplomatic relation with Israel. I think sometimes that's lost in the noise. I do think they have an important influence, as we saw recently with the Hamas leadership meeting in Turkey. And what I can say to you, I'm in very frequent contact, as is the Foreign Secretary, particularly myself, with the Foreign Minister of Turkey, and they are playing a specific role. I talked about messages being landed, articulating what I've just said. Landing messages to Hamas is that stop the war now, put down the weapons, and bring about the release of hostages, and so we can have a pathway to actually resolve this crisis. So Turkey, in short, yes, have an important role. They are a big player across Europe and Asia. They are a bridging player, and they have influence over the Hamas leadership.
Is that because of the Muslim Brotherhood dynamic, or is that separate to that?
Well, I think everyone needs to recognise. I don't think it's this kind of should be defined from another organisation or by religious issues alone. Of course, they have a sense of, they've entertained and they've invited Hamas leadership to Turkey, but they've done it with the intent of not suddenly saying we're going to supply you a whole load of arms. On the contrary, they've done it to try and bring a resolution to this conflict, and I think it's important. But I do agree with you. I think Turkey hasn't been talked about in the same way as Qatar, perhaps, on the hostage issues. But I think not just on hostages, but for the medium long-term resolution, I think Turkey will have an important role.
Thank you so much. Brendan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. Can I take you back to what you talked about the food and the famine in Gaza? On May the 6th, the United Nations said there is a full-blown famine in northern Gaza. Does the UK government accept that there is a famine in Gaza?
I think if you're referring to the IFP reports that came out as well, I think that's why we've pressed on the issue of the Erris crossing. I think we're on the brink of famine. I'll ask Stephen to come in. I haven't yet seen a specific report, but whether we're on the brink or we're in famine, the fact is, there is malnutrition. Evidence of that is very clear. The facilities in hospitals is dire, and people are dying because of a lack of medicine, support and basic amenities, and we need to ensure that happens. We shouldn't wait for famine to occur. We need to act and act now.
Well, why, in your opinion, or in the opinion of the UK government, why is there a famine in Gaza?
Well, I think the straight answer to that is very much because of the restrictions which are imposed on aid getting in through the borders.
So, do you then believe that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war?
I think those assessments we make constantly. I think the Foreign Secretary over the weekend again said very clearly about that there's no clean bill of health for Israel in any shape or form. There's constant reviews which take place on the way Israel is prosecuting this war. And I think Israel needs to recognise that the situation in Gaza, they as the occupying power under the Geneva Conventions have direct responsibilities, and they need to ensure that the food, the medicines, the support, the humanitarian aid that's needed needs to get in and get in now.
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree with any of that, but if I go back to my question, do you or does the UK government believe that Israel is weaponising food in terms of its delivery to Gaza? Is it using starvation as a weapon of war?
That's not the judgment the UK government has drawn, but what we have said very clearly is that we're on the brink of famine in Gaza. Food needs to get in, medicines need to get in, and Israel, just take a brief step back, why we hold Israel responsible and in the way we have quite directly is because Israel is signed up to these conventions. Israel is a state, and I agree with you, Brendan, it has obligations. You're asking for a specific analysis. That forms part and parcel of the assessments we make, and of course we're seized with the reports which are coming through. I proactively mentioned the IFP report. The assessment, if you're saying overall for the UK government, I've not seen an assessment that determination has been made. But what's very clear to me, the reality on the ground is that people are in need of food, in need of medicine, in need of humanitarian aid, and we need to ensure that we implore upon Israel to do all it can with its responsibilities it has as a established state on the world stage with obligations under the Geneva Convention as an occupying power to fulfill them, and it should be held accountable for those.
Yeah, but given that, how else would you explain children dying of hunger and malnutrition in an area of the world in which food is plentiful, just 44 miles from Tel Aviv, when the people who are responsible for the flow of that food is the Israeli government? So how else would you explain that happening if it's not being used as a weapon of war?
What's clearly happening in Gaza right now is aid is not getting through, food is not getting through, medicines are not getting through, and that's why the UK government, we've been focused with other partners, including those in the near vicinity. But you've asked me a specific question on the determination, and I said that assessment has not been made by the UK government.
You accept that aid is not getting through, you accept that food is not getting through, and the people that it has to come through, surely any determination has to say that those people are responsible for it not getting to where it needs to be, and therefore, as the occupying power, surely there is a legal responsibility on them to do that, and if they don't do it, then they are indeed weaponising it.
And what I'm saying is those assessments are constantly and consistently made, and our relationship with Israel means that we're able to land those messages quite directly to them. You asked a specific question on assessment made, and I I understand that. But as I said to you, is that, yes, when we look at the situation on the ground, I could stand here and say, look, we've got so much aid in through airdrops, but compared to a proportionality of what needs to happen, it is not enough. It's clearly not enough. And we need to ensure that this issue, the report, certainly the last one I read, was that there was a risk of famine, and a real risk of famine, particularly in northern Gaza, which was the IFP report. And we need to ensure, and that's why we pressurised Israel to get the Erez crossing opening. I'm not accepting for a moment, Brendan, that it's, for example, some of the, we managed to get aid in flour through Ashdod, which was going through the Erez. It got attacked. And that needs to ensure, and yes, we have made that point directly to the Israelis, that those who are attacking these convoys should be held accountable. You've asked for a specific point of determination. I've been clear on that. But whatever happens from here on in and in the future, we keep this issue under really, really strict scrutiny to ensure that its obligations of Israel, and that's why people say Hamas are doing this. Of course, there's issues of distribution. The distribution channels in Gaza at the moment are really challenged. But at the same time, the first obligation, the difference between Hamas and Israel is a state. It's a partner, it's an ally to the United Kingdom, and we need, and I assure you, we use every diplomatic lever quite directly and quite bluntly with Israel to ensure that they recognise their obligations in this respect.
Just briefly on that, Minister, humanitarian aid organisations tell me that not a single aid delivery has gone through the Rafah crossing since the 6th of May, which obviously was the primary delivery route. That also means there have been no medical evacuations of Gazans through that route, no aid workers have gone in or out through that crossing, and separately, Karam Sharom in the immediate area facility is currently being bombed as well, and therefore that is highly affecting whether or not aid is getting in. Is it true that no aid has got in through the Rafah crossing since the 6th of May?
Yeah, the Rafah, Stephen may correct
Rafah.
me, but the last report last night, there was no opening, and that's why, again, I said the crucial part of Rafah was that's where mainly the fuel crossing was going. And again, to kind of give you a real-life insight into it, one of the things yesterday I was exploring with Mark Bryson Richardson, our ambassador, who I engage with practically every other day. He's in Israel as I speak. And one of the points we're raising directly is, one, either get Rafah open, or Karim Shalom has the capability and capacity to provide fuel. And fuel is needed. Coming back to some points Brendan also alluded to, I'm very clear on this. The fuel is needed to run the hospitals. And if the hospitals don't get fuel, the very issues that we just talked about will be further exacerbated. So those points we're very much seized by them. But the fact is, yes, in the direct answer, Rafah remains closed. Stephen, I don't think it's opened, has it?
That's correct, Minister. No aid has flowed through the Rafah crossing in recent days, and it is an urgent priority that the crossing is open again, that Karim Shalom is opened again, and that more aid, in addition to those two crossings, can enter through other crossings such as Eretz and also through the north, so that goods from Ashdod could come into Gaza. So it's an urgent priority, and we are working this. As the Minister said, our humanitarian envoy, Mark Bryson Richardson, is in Israel today raising this. The Foreign Secretary spoke to Foreign Minister Katz yesterday and to Ron Dermer, and we're pressing this very hard.
Thank you, Bob.
Just to follow up that point, from the diplomatic cables, reports that you get from our embassy in Israel, what are our diplomats telling you about how much Israel is focusing when it comes to targeting, how much Israel takes into account issues of proportionality? So to what extent, just related to Brendan's point, to what extent is the deaths of civilians due to a sort of sense of negligence or to an attempt at proportionality, but you're dealing with targeting Hamas terrorists in a very crowded space in which there are many other human beings? What are your diplomats on the ground telling you?
Well, I think the current live situation, if we take Rafah, I think the diplomatic pressure that's been exerted by ourselves, but also in particular by the United States, has resulted in a more restrained operation compared to what we saw in Gaza City and Khan Yunis. Does Israel have the capacity and capability to comply on the obligations? Yes, we believe it does. It's got one of the most advanced militaries in the world. On the issue of the prosecution of the war, as I said, this is something which is looked at intensely and regularly by us in making our own assessments, but also Israel has direct obligations through the conventions that it also has to be adhering to on the issue of proportionality as well. But our own assessment, you asked about what's coming through from our missions on the ground, is very clear that currently, and as I said, this thing can change very, very quickly, that the operation in Rafah compared to what happened in Gaza City or Khan Yunis has not been to the scale and intensity that those two operations took place. However, I would add, and this is very much sees, there's no plan. Israel has not shown us a plan, a credible plan of one evacuation, because again on these principles, humanitarian is an important principle. Al-Mawasi, where the people from Rafah are being sent, which is now circa about 400,000 that have been moved. You get a leaflet in the morning saying you must move by the afternoon. It's a pretty stark choice, and people have that. I mean, if nothing else, we've seen the resilience of the way the Palestinians have moved from one place to the other. But Israel, and we do this consistently, and as Stephen alluded to in recent calls that the Foreign Secretary's had, is their obligations to the very principles you've just mentioned.
Brendan.
Minister, you and your fellow ministers, indeed the government, often talk about Israel's capacity and capability to adhere to international humanitarian law. Now, I have the capacity and the capability to do many things. Doesn't mean I always do them. And given what you've just said about the Rafah crossing being closed and no aid coming in since the 6th, talking about the famine that is either there or on the brink, can you honestly say that Israel's activities demonstrate a commitment to respecting international humanitarian law?
I think Israel's obligations to IHL is very clear for them to see. We have an assessment procedure, and I'm sure you'll respect this, Brendan, that we go through, and through those assessment procedures, I very clearly give my perspectives as a minister for the Middle East in how I perceive this on the information which is given. An overall assessment is made, and a determination is made after that of the British government's position. That's happened before. It happens on a revolving basis. What's very clear to me, I think the challenges are intense and immense on IHL, and from what we've already discussed, I think it's very clear from what my thinking is. I think Israel is really leaving many of its partners, including ourselves, pretty challenged on where we are currently on the issue of IHL and how they are fulfilling their obligations. But I would add quite clearly that there is a established process which the Foreign Secretary has talked about repeatedly, which he ultimately opines on from the information he receives, and those assessments happen. This isn't a case of saying there's a green light to Israel. Israel has obligations. We are allies of Israel, and as a constructive friend to Israel, we land these points very directly to them. But at the same time, we make these assessments consistently. All the points you've made, there's been nothing I've disagreed with in what you're saying, and I said those should lend into what happens from here on in, and future decisions that are made will be based on some of these assessments and some of the points that we've been discussing. And these happen at a very regular and periodic level, which allows us to make a determination. But I'm not going to preempt a determination of a process.
Mm-hmm. I hear what you're saying, and as I said earlier on, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but the actions of the UK government just don't chime. The Foreign Secretary, as you alluded to earlier, on Sunday said that Israel does not have a clean bill of health when it comes to its military operations in Gaza. And just yesterday, US Secretary of State Blinken said, given the totality of the damage that's been done to children, women and men, it was reasonable to assess that in certain circumstances Israel acted in a way which is not consistent with international humanitarian law. Now, he was talking there about the munitions that has not been sent from the United States. So given their concerns, given the Foreign Secretary's admission about not having a clean bill of health, why then are we continuing to licence arms export to Israel?
Well, I think on that final point, you would have heard the Foreign Secretary consistently say, yes, our arms exports, there's a process involved with that. He is very much sticking to that process because this is something that we deploy in all conflicts with ever any shipments. There's no sort of state shipments of arms to Israel, as you know already, and whilst our position to the US is different, where I agree with you, there has to be that principle that applies, whether it's 1% or 90%, the principle should be, is there a contravention? And I think that assessment, as I've already alluded, is made in a robust way. It's something that is fed through from the advice that we see, including myself. I see that, I give my very clear opinion on that view, and that gets then taken up through the other assessments that the Foreign Secretary will make, and he'll make a decision on this. I think he also said very clearly on over the weekend that this is something that is done on an evolving and quite a dynamic basis, and he'll certainly be looking at advice, and some of the points you've just raised will be, I'm sure, points he'll reflect on as he considers that advice.
Bring in Fabian.
Sorry, can I just briefly come in, Lord Ahmad? We used to have a system called the Committee on Arms Export Control. The government stopped that committee some time ago, I think last year.
Forgive me, it wasn't the government, it was a decision by select committees.
Okay, sorry, my apologies. But would you agree that such a committee allowing parliamentarians to scrutinise these arms export licences would now be very appropriate in terms of what's happening in Israel?
Well, I think it's always good to listen and learn from experience, and certainly, I mean, it's something I'm quite happy to take back to the FCDO to discuss with the Foreign Secretary as well on how we do have a robust, I'm sure you'll agree, Fabian, regime that looks at issues which has been tested previously in other cases in terms of arms supplies that we've provided. But I also reflect on the fact if things and systems and structures can be improved, then we need to see how they can be. So I can't comment directly on whether that's something we would deploy. I'll certainly take that.
No, I fully appreciate that, but the point is that parliamentarians should be involved in these decisions, and these decisions should be accountable to parliamentarians through whatever structure or system possible. It may need to evolve or change.
We've got, I mean, internally what we do, I mean, just to sort of share with you and without sort of going into too much detail, but there are, in the assessments that the Foreign Secretary will ultimately make, they are informed by different types of advice from different parts of government, which will be making assessments both on adherence, coming back to the issue of IHL, but also on terms of exports. Then there's assessments made by our colleagues across in the MOD, and then there's, of course, advice which is given to the Foreign Secretary. In terms of parliamentary assessments, I think there have been occasions where there is information which obviously the executive has, which isn't necessarily because of the sensitivity of it, which is across the piece. But as I said, there's always ways to look at seeing structures and seeing how we can sort of reflect on those structures. I don't know, Stephen, you got...
And forgive me, obviously we've had the Foreign Secretary write to us on this, and also we're aware that ultimately the decision sits with Department for Business and Trade, not with the Foreign Office. Cameron provides advice, DBT makes a decision, and actually there'll be a hearing by the DBT committee specifically on this shortly. Just briefly, however, it has been 5 months now since Medley for Palestinians was bombed when they were in the so-called continuing safe zone of Al-Mawasi, despite having been deconflicted by the IDF a month earlier. We were very lucky that British doctors were not killed. It was luck, not anything else. We obviously also had the bombing of World Central Kitchen, where 3 British former soldiers were killed. We have had no answer yet as to how that happened when both were deconflicted with the IDF. What is the answer the British government has received, and how British nationals were almost and then were killed?
First of all, you're right. So although we have got some assessments made by the Israelis themselves on the tragic killing of the World Central Kitchen team, we still are waiting more answers. We're looking at, for example, independent assessments that we can make where, for example, Australia have deployed someone we're talking to because there were Poles and Australians involved with that. But the issue is very clear that if, particularly in both instances, thankfully in the medical aid for Palestine, there were no fatalities on that incident, but it was very close. And I met with Melanie Ward quite directly. We raised it. I know the Foreign Secretary raised it quite directly with the Israeli leadership, including with the Prime Minister, as he did with the World Central Kitchen. And we need answers on this, that you cannot, with all the challenges and the issues we've been talking about, these individuals, these organisations are carrying out vital work. And as part of the standards, again, Israel is a country that obligates, is signed up to adhering to these standards, that needs to ensure the deconfliction. The whole point of deconfliction, and it's a key priority, I know, for the Foreign Secretary and myself in emphasising this to Israel, is to ensure that, notwithstanding the politics of it, that agencies and workers can go around. That I know, as I was coming in this morning as well, I was listening, as yet there's no attribution on that, but there was another UN worker who also has been killed. So we need to ensure that the deconfliction does mean it, and where it's shared, particularly, as I said, I don't hold out hope with Hamas, but where we do hold out hope and quite have direct engagement with is with Israel to ensure that they fulfil their obligations.
Thank you. Brendan and then Graham.
Very briefly, Minister. On that, has the UK yet determined whether British licensed arms exports were involved in these attacks?
That's not something that there's more advice which will be coming through to the Foreign Secretary, including that particular incident on the World Central Kitchen, and I know that'll be going to him shortly.
But has that question been asked? Has an investigation been launched into whether UK licensed arms exports were involved in the MAP attack and the World Central Kitchen attack?
I think with that particular incident, what's very clear is that we want to ensure that these points are covered off in the advice which is given to the Foreign Secretary. The Chair summarised very neatly what happens in terms of these issues on arms licences, and we're following that procedure when it comes to the World Central Kitchen incident.
Okay, but can I just be absolutely clear? Are you seeking to determine whether UK licensed arms exports were involved in either of those attacks? And is that a question? Will we get that answer in due course? Will we find that out?
Well, as I said, what I can share with you right now is that I am aware that there will be full advice coming on what happened, both on the issue of deconfliction and the incident itself, and that, I believe, will be comprehensive in terms of the exact detail. I haven't seen it, so I can't comment further.
Perhaps the Foreign Secretary could see that advice before he comes before us at the start of June. I'm sure the Foreign Office have it within them to get that advice to him within time, given it's been 5 months for one of them, and then we'll raise it again with him. Graham.
Hamas have an explicit policy of genocide, of destroying Israel and killing Jews. That's their policy. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that he doesn't believe in the two-state solution. Most of the other international interested parties do believe in the two-state solution, including the UK. What tactics and strategy in that situation do you have for getting on a road and a pathway to the two-state solution?
Well, the starting point on that, Graham, must be, first you've got to believe in the right of the other to exist. Another one who doesn't believe in that, it becomes very hard as negotiating partners. But what has happened, first and foremost, I would go further. Hamas don't actually believe in destruction of killing all Jews. They believe that if that ideology that they follow, which is a perverse ideology, anyone who may claim to follow the same faith they claim to follow, which is so removed, are also legitimate targets. So I think when we're dealing with Hamas, we're very clear, and that's why we prescribe them. But I think what needs to happen, Hamas cannot be, as we've said clearly, in power in Gaza for this to continue. But there are partners for peace. Is there work happening in this respect? Absolutely. I said right at the start of the intensity of diplomacy, there are plans which are being floated around, including with the US and our Arab partners. We're party to some of these discussions, but the starting point has to be in a phased way. First and foremost, the fighting must stop. Brendan and I, Fabian and others, we've had exchanges, and rightly so, on the issue of humanitarian support, getting the hostages out. That has to be a prerequisite to getting these restarted. The third element is looking at the whole issue of reconstruction. And the fourth element is that we need to give, as has said repeatedly, and it's our stated position, an irreversible pathway to ensuring that we do get two-state solution. To my absolute core, I believe that ultimately this is the moment to seize the opportunity to say what are the structures that need to be put in place. And one of the discussions we have internationally with each of our partners as we sit round tables is, if you are the United Kingdom, or if you are Qatar, or if you are Saudi Arabia, what are you bringing, what equity are you bringing in achievement of that objective? And that's where our focus has been. But it's in that kind of structured way, because all of this becomes pretty immaterial until we actually get this first important step, which is to stop the fighting.
If I could ask you to expand on the Arab states, because it was speculated, and I think it's probably true, that one of the reasons for the October the 7th attack was because there was détente happening between Saudi Arabia and other Arab states with Israel, which didn't suit either the Iranians or Hamas. October the 7th and Israel's response have put an end to that détente certainly for a period. What is your assessment of the attitude of the involved Arab states to a move towards a two-state solution?
Well, I think first we've seen movement. If I was to take one sort of glimmer of hope in this abhorrent tragedy which we're currently facing, is we're in a different position. We have two Arab states. We have Jordan and Egypt, who have peace treaties with Israel. We have three Gulf states, the UAE, two, the UAE and Bahrain, and then with the Arab states, Morocco, who have also signed the Abraham Accords. But that's, if you like, the first chapter. The final chapter will be the two-state solution. And they, by moving forward, and let's be clear, notwithstanding the situation as it currently is, we haven't seen a kind of curtailing or seizing or cutting off of diplomatic relations. So I think there's been a recognition by these countries that they need to remain steadfast. We are, yes, you're right, prior to the 7th of October, there were discussions on normalisation with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and obviously that is a very important priority. Indeed, it was a stated priority of the Israeli Prime Minister. But one thing is very clear, just to share with you, is that Saudis themselves have been explicit on this, that for normalisation to happen, it's also important that there is this irreversible pathway to a two-state solution. So it's an integrated part of the discussions we're having, and indeed they're having with us, and those are the messages which are obviously being landed in Israel. But you're right also when you said, Graham, that Mr. Netanyahu and his government don't actually believe in the two-state solution. But there have been others. It was not so long ago, it seems far distance, it was in 2021 when the then Israeli Prime Minister addressing the UN General Assembly did talk of the two-state solution, and I think that was the first time since 2017. So there is that sort of fourth pillar, if I can put it that way. There is a lot of work being done in that respect. But to move it forward, that first stage has to happen.
One of the issues that exercises people in this country and makes a pathway towards peace and then to a two-state solution more difficult is not just the war that's happening in Gaza, the conflict in Gaza. There has been a long period where Palestinians in the West Bank have been attacked and killed by Israelis. What is your assessment of that situation? Do you believe does the Foreign Office believe it's getting worse and that it is having a negative effect on any eventual solution to this problem?
Short answer, yes. Categorically, I think what we've seen is some of the biggest announcements of land seizures in the West Bank. A consistent position of successive governments has always been that settlements in the occupied territories are impediments to the peace process. Many of us have visited, I've been there as well. The intimidation used by extremist settlers is not just vented against Palestinians, it's often vented against international dignitaries who are visiting. I've experienced that myself. What we have done, and I alluded earlier to the time in office, I've not known a time where we had previously taken action of sanctioning individuals. We've now done it on 2 occasions, and most recently this month we've also sanctioned organisations, extremist organisations linked to settler violence. And we've also directly landed the message of accountability with the Israelis. So in summary, I agree with you. I think the point you asked me, yes, they're an impediment, that we have seen an increase on settlement announcements and land grabs happening in the West Bank. And the other thing which is really noticeable, we were talking, and rightly we've been talking about Gaza, but we've seen, several hundred, 300, 400 people who've been killed in the West Bank. Detentions have increased in the West Bank, incursions have increased, and by the operations that then happen, we've seen the PA become increasingly ineffective, and settlers seem more emboldened. Some of the activity which has taken place has been appalling, which also, I think, settler groups recognise there's been settlers, and there was a young 14-year-old who was killed as well. This is a tragedy which engulfs all communities. But in the West Bank, yes, we have tragically seen an increase of both settler activity and violence. But the UK, as I said, for the first time, we've acted quite directly by exercising sanctions on them.
In answer to Brendan's question, you pointed out a role that Israel has as an occupying power to protect people. I mean, it's obviously a very difficult thing to do when you're fighting a terrorist organisation. But I've been asked when I've talked to some of the concerned, mainly Muslim groups in my constituency, what do Palestinians have the right to defend themselves? Hamas is a terrorist organisation prescribed, and where is the balance between Israel's responsibility as an occupying power to protect people and the right of Palestinians to protect themselves? Can you help me through that political and legal minefield?
I mean, it's a question I've been asked repeatedly as well. And I think what is very, very clear is what needs to happen is that the governance of the Palestinians, we need to focus on that, is the who. And we're certainly focused on that with the Palestinian Authority. So you have a responsible authority, a responsible Palestinian governance structure, which has secured, we've seen it after the Oslo Accords were signed. It seems, again, 30-odd years ago that was done. But when we invested, for example, in the Palestinian Authority security forces, some of those issues of security and governance were being directly addressed. But that has declined massively. And what we've seen is through Hamas's control of Gaza. Hamas, I don't think there will be any, and I'm speculating purely here, always dangerous for a minister, but I'm sure most of you would agree with me. I don't think there'd be any Palestinian in Gaza right now celebrating what Hamas has put on them. Yes, it was difficult beforehand, but now what we see is pure devastation which has taken place, no livelihoods, no nothing. Coming back to your central point, I think what we've said, and it perhaps also reflects on what Brendan was pressing me on as well, and indeed I think Bob alluded to this, is Israel has the capacity to be able to go in much more in a measured and structured way against those who are perpetrators of the violence, aggression and terrorism. And that's what needs to be implored in when we have those engagements with them. Yes, we will make judgment calls on their prosecution of the war. On the issue of Palestinian rights and the rights, one thing I would also say is the Palestinians are also reflective of different communities. There are Muslim and Christian communities that constitute the Palestinians. So when we talk about the rights of Palestinians, we need to ensure governance which protects the rights of all communities, including, one hopes, if I was being very focused in the future, maybe there'll come a time that we'll have a future state of Palestine, which is inclusive, I use that word deliberately, of Jews who will be settled in Palestine. Because when we go back in history, one of the key parts was across the world, Jewish communities were also representative, as we've heard from Fabian, in other parts of the Islamic world. We need to seize that again, and I'm not being too sort of crystal ball gazing, but we've got to accept that the human capacity to sort of get over this incredible human challenge right now is in the hands of ourselves in part, but also directly those there. But I fully accept the principle that you've alluded, and the real strength of feeling that's there, that Palestinians themselves don't have anyone protecting them, and that's what we're seeking to create now. But we need an empowered Palestinian governance structure to that happen. Let's see, there's a new Prime Minister in place with Mohammed Mustafa, whether that provides that kind of security structure and governance structure.
My last question, if I may. The last time you were before the committee, I asked you how you thought the Foreign Office government policy could help locally with the relations between the Jewish community and the Muslim community. I think over the last 6 months, both communities have got more frightened and more angry, almost in equal measure, the meetings I have with those communities. What more can you do as a minister? What more can the government do to help foster better relations when those communities are so angry?
Well, I mean, firstly, I think the security, the safety of all communities is something we pride ourselves, irrespective of political, whether you're from Scotland or the UK. If we lose that, we lose what we are as a country, and I think there's a lot we've achieved. So I think that message of reassurance is very clear, notwithstanding the challenges we find, the ability that we still have, notwithstanding security concerns in synagogues, in mosques, etc., that people still go about their daily lives in relative security. We've got to take the oxygen away from the extremists on both sides and not allow division to be the prevailing narrative. To do that needs investment in local communities for people. Perhaps there's a role also, and I stand ready to do that, in how we brief out to some of the communities. On Friday, there were members of the Jewish community who were in my office representing Jewish leaders, again talking about the rising tide of anti-Semitism and how it's impacting British communities. I myself, being Muslim, have been engaging extensively with Muslim communities. It's not been easy. On a personal note, I've never known a time like it, and with the intensity of the attacks, which I totally understand, we need to ensure that is government's responsibility to navigate this path. But I think we need to take like-minded community leaders from all sides to sort of come forward with practical suggestions. And, roles we have in our respective roles is also important in how we communicate this better as well. So everyone is seized with it. I can assure you, with every community meeting I go to, every time I go for a prayer at a mosque with my children, every time I say my salam as I finish the prayer, I'm surrounded. I used to get that anyway, with everyone offering me an opinion on every facet of foreign policy. Believe you me, right now, it's pretty strong opinions I get. But I think I don't have the direct answer, but we can't lose sight of what we have, and we need these community groups. And I said this to the Jewish leaders as well. I said, work with the Muslim leaders, come back with practical things that work. Don't be deterred with what we've achieved to date.
Thank you.
We're going to move on, Minister, but I would just lodge concerns about the fact that it does seem to be escalating outside of the West Bank, the points you made to Graham. In the last 2 weeks, attacks on 3 convoys from Jordan, the arson attack on UNRWA, again overnight, more attacks on aid convoys, and how important it is that the need for restraint is really clearly expressed to the Israeli government.
It is. I mean, we've called it out publicly, I would say. I've personally put out statements on this.
Thank you. Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. Can I widen the discussion out now slightly? Because I wondered whether you could give us your opinion as to how important for regional stability are some of the strong men that we see around the region, the long-term survivors. I'm thinking, obviously, of President Erdogan in Turkey, Netanyahu, of course, famously the longest-serving Prime Minister in Israel, Sisi, of course, in Egypt, not quite as long-serving, but nonetheless a fairly strong man, and of course the monarchies, the two that come particularly to mind are King Abdullah of Jordan and King Mohammed VI of Morocco. How important are they, and how might things change if they were no longer there? What are we doing, in fact, to support the people that those leaders that we think are doing a good job, like the kings of Morocco and Jordan, who are so important to the peace processes?
I agree. I mean, taking Morocco first, we've, again, as the minister responsible, we've had an extensive level of engagement. Foreign Minister Baruta and I talk very regularly. And whilst they're removed from the issues we've just been talking about, they have an important role. Coming back to some things Brendan was focused on, the where and getting humanitarian aid in. Ashdod, as you'll know, is full of Moroccans, Moroccan heritage people. And that actually, yes, we helped to facilitate. We had the structures, and then we, because of our relationship with Morocco, were able to share those. And we did see Moroccan aid was one of the first aids to get through because of the relationship between His Majesty and the Israeli government. So we've been helping to strengthen that. So the short answer in Morocco's case is absolutely, we've seen them play an important role in the Abraham Accords. They've stood firm on this particular issue, and our relationship with them is strong, even on, just to digress for a moment, when the earthquakes hit. Actually, our relationship meant that we were the ones who helped to facilitate UN access into Morocco. King Abdullah, I always found him to be extremely inspiring. Indeed, he was one of the first people I met when this current crisis broke out, whether it's on the messages that Graham was just alluding to about coexistence. His famous Amman message, I think, is very powerful, and that needs to resonate more than ever. And that's why, most recently, my engagement with Jordan was an inward-bound visit with their investment minister, and we were very clear about the role we can have to play, the requirements that are needed for stability, for investment within Jordan. But Jordan, as we all know, is very dependent and is perhaps arguably most impacted by what's happening in Israel and Palestine. So I think that, again, is an important relationship. You mentioned about President Erdogan, again, in answering Bob earlier. I think that Turkey have an important role. He recognises the strength of Israel. And again, if I can say quite bilaterally, the strength of our bilateral relations lend into providing that influence. And I think they will be playing a role continuing, not just on the current crisis, but going forward more widely. And when we look at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, both the Foreign Secretary and I have had, in the last few months, 2 meetings. Stephen was also present with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He has a clear vision of where he wants to go. They're a key component on this. And also with other countries. I'm a great fan of the Bahrainis. I think they've made some great progress. We haven't touched on, but often a challenging issue in the Middle East is the issue of human rights. The progress we've made with Bahrainis, and I will just one final point on that, Fabian. Why? Is we've got to put the lens of that country as it stands today to make progress on issues we want to see. These countries want to...
Dan does actually want to bring you back to this in detail, so I'm going to cut it short so that he can do that.
I'll wait for that, but I would make that point.
No, I agree with you about Bahrain.
Bob?
What do you see as the main threats to the UK and UK interests in the MENA, Middle East and North Africa region, and where do you think they are most likely to materialise? So terrorism, extremism, population explosion, population migration, climate change. What are the things generally in the region that concern you most?
Well, I think we've seen with the events in the Middle East, security is an immense challenge. The threat of malign actors and the influence through proxies, which we've already alluded to. I think the prosperity agenda is a very important one, and that's why we've been pursuing this more widely through our GCC FTA, and I hope we'll be able to make some real progress on that. We also need to recognise the strength of foreign direct investment into the UK. I mean, yesterday I did 2 events, 200th anniversary of our relations with Bahrain and 125 years with Kuwait, and Kuwaiti investment fund, as you know, is one of the largest sovereign investors in the UK. So the economic prosperity, then the real dangers we need to be harnessing the whole issues around AI and cyber and how we work with key countries with our own capabilities and capacities. The security, regional security, is important to them. We've seen them with agreements they've signed, for example, again, using Bahrain as an example, the discussions the Saudis are having with the US, that we need to develop that sort of cohesive and coherent security plan for them as well. And the people-to-people link on a kind of more progressive note, I think the recent electronic visa schemes we've introduced have also helped to assist.
Okay, so do you think just listening to your answer, do you think the security extremism debate that obviously dominates the media because it is accompanied by violence very often, do you think that is overstated when it comes to your work in the region?
If you're meaning, what we have seen is all it takes is a trigger to spark something, and before it can become a major issue. I talked about malign actors here. We've talked about Iran quite specifically. And we've seen how the ability to spark something through proxies is very real. And the other thing I would say, Bob, is what happens there has a direct impact, as we've seen across the world. People often talk about the impact it has on the Arab street or the streets of the Middle East. It has resonance across the world.
When it comes to the drivers changing life in the Middle East, what do you think they primarily are? And looking at, obviously there's a great deal of difference between North Africa, between the misery in Gaza, but also in the Gulf as well. So what are the drivers that you are keeping an eye on or you're aware of?
I'll ask Stephen to come in on this, but I think it's across the piece. I've already alluded to the prosperity agenda, enhanced trade with many of these countries. Working together on issues such as human rights, I think, is personally important to me, and we've seen progress in this respect. Climate, let's not forget, after our COP, we've had COPs in Egypt, we've had COPs in the UAE on how we strengthen climate partnership. The Saudis have a very ambitious program on turning a large part of their desert into a solar park. Again, these are existential challenges which we're facing, which we need to work with the region on. The people-to-people link. Education, we haven't touched on. One of the biggest, always on a lighter note, which I found quite directly when I was in Algeria. I signed an agreement where primary school education in Algeria is now delivered in English, and we've also got that now happening in tertiary education as well. I think a few weeks later, President Macron was there with 6 ministers. I think because this influence, so our soft power that we have through our universities, through the education sphere, I think also add to this as well. Stephen,
I think we're
sorry.
Okay, no worries.
I was going to ask one more question. Do you mind if I do? Okay, I'm not trying to sound cynical, and it's great that you're talking about messages landing, and it's wonderful that we have, all these connections. But do you accept the fact that it's all very well messages landing, but actually results is not a message landing, but it's getting people to change behaviour? And in some of the examples you've given about messages landing either with the Palestinians or the Israelis or the Iranians, I don't necessarily see progress after that message has landed. So giving a message is great, but actually are we using all our power, soft, hard power, and this mix of sort of smart power, however you want to define it, to actually get our way or to have our voice heard and to have our influence out there?
Short answer, yes, but I also agree with you that you've got to see the real delivery is through the action on the ground. Taking certain countries in the region, as an example, we have seen reforms. Again, taking Bahrain as a working example, our investments over several years have resulted in alternative sentencing, moratoriums on the death penalty. Now, these are priorities in UK foreign policy, but they're helping to deliver. Why? Because I come back to the point, there's practical investments we've made through people, through technical support, but also sharing insights and experiences. So yes, we're getting delivery on Israel, Palestine, Iran, etc. They do resonate. What the UK think, I do feel strongly, diplomatically, matters. And that's why we are seeing, one hopes, in certain countries, the fact that Iran did not pursue further escalation, I think, was an important part of that extensive engagement and intense diplomacy conducted by the Foreign Secretary. So it's not perfect, and yes, I totally agree with you. The real fruits of that labour come from actions on the ground. But do we see results from our diplomacy? I would answer yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Chair, good morning, Lord Ahmad. You were just talking to Fabian about some of the progress made in Bahrain, and I wanted to ask you a little more about our influence on the issue of human rights. Perhaps I could let you finish the points.
No, in Bahrain, what's one thing I come from, and again, many of these countries are Muslim, so it becomes slightly personal. Human rights were at the core of my upbringing, my thinking, my faith learning, etc. So it really riles me that we don't see this in practical terms across many of these countries. But what we've seen in Bahrain through a constructive level of engagement, I'm not saying all the objectives have been achieved. We have seen a progress on many different areas. I've already said to Bob about alternative sentencing, juvenile justice. We've seen progress in terms of human rights overall, women's rights. Who would have thought? I didn't think so when I got appointed as minister in 2017 that I'd be invited to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on a human rights mission. I wasn't MENA minister at that time, but I was. And what we're seeing, 39% of people employed in Saudi Arabia, including at senior levels now, are women. The difference we've seen on gender representation in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and across other countries. Qatar, I would say, is a good example. UAE, we've done a great deal of work with them, and there's a real progress and opening up. But I come back to a key point in all of this. You know, human rights are probably the most challenging part of my portfolio, notwithstanding the discussions we've had just now on Israel-Palestine. But you must start with the starting point of where that country is today. And if you look back at our own history from the suffragette movements in terms of, it was 1928 when women in totality got rights, and you share that history, it becomes a very different tone of conversation in terms of substance and results, which, again, Bob was alluding to. So, yes, we are doing some really good work and collaborations with key countries on this very agenda.
In terms of balancing the need and the role of states in the region that are providing stability and important leadership and are key allies to the UK, how do you tackle individual human rights abuses that you see reported?
First and foremost, there's cases, it's a vast subject, but you can break it down into there are issues that arise from consular cases which exist, and those can take up time. The first thing I think, as a rule, a minister should be able to do is offer direct access to them, to myself on certain cases, and certainly I've done that because it provides a degree and a real sort of horizon of hope for the family concerned on any issue which has arisen, and a kind of constructive understanding on how you can resolve this issue. Sometimes it comes from a lack of understanding of culture, of insights, of local practices, and they can be almost accidental. This is specific to consular. On broader issues of human rights, we've got to see where the best equity is in terms of making progress on this particular issue. I mean, just taking the example of human rights and women's rights, one of the things I've often challenged when this regression nature, we talked about the tragic case of Mahsa Amini. I've said this in the House of Lords out of the dispatch book. The first person to accept Islam was a woman. The Prophet of Islam was working for her. She proposed to him. So actually, let's have a discussion with that part of the world about equality, but do it in that context. That cannot then be challenged. And if I'm wrong, tell me, because these are facts. And I think that is the way of bridging gaps, is having a working understanding of the situation you're dealing with and where you will get the best return on how you invest, but do it in a way of partnership working, of constructive engagements. And in all these, particularly, I would say, in the MENA region, more than anything, relationships matter. The investment, I'm sure you, in your travels, have found that. Those relationships you nurture matter, because sometimes on some of the most challenging issues, where I've been able to resolve it is picking up the phone to X, and they're saying, okay, Tariq, got you, and we're able to do that. And I think that investment in relationship is going to be key going forward.
I mean, one example is this week the BBC is reporting that in Saudi Arabia, serious human rights abuses in the building of its new city to clear land, and it's a project that's being delivered by Western companies as well. Is that something you'll be taking up?
I think in all of these we have what I call constructive human rights dialogue. I alluded earlier to me going to Saudi. I think it was October, November last year. We had Dr. Hala, who's head of the Saudi Human Rights Commission. She visited the UK. So she met with judges here. She met with women's groups, civil society as well. And that was our way of actually demonstrably showing how we can be constructive and how they engage. On the questions you raise on human rights, across the piece, whether it's Saudi or any other country, we will raise these. But I think we also need to balance it. This isn't about headlining everything. The best way you unravel human rights issues, whether it's consular issues or specific cases or indeed broader issues, is through constructive engagement, diplomatic engagement, but sometimes done in a very private way as well, and you get more return. Sometimes there are atrocious issues which happen, as we've seen in Iran, and that needs a collective effort of countries like ourselves to actually call those out.
And just finally, taking a step back from the specific issues, do you think in the sort of multipolar world that everybody talks about, us living in now, there is more consciousness by countries that are by autocracies, led by Russia, China, against democratic values, against liberal values, and how do you see the dispute between the two?
We've got to be very clear about this. Of course, there's a challenge provided. We've seen how Russia's acted. It's less talked about, but the influence of the Wagner Group was very clear in key clear parts of Africa, where we saw a growing influence, which was an interesting influence they brought. It wasn't just about a mercenary group. They also provided an economic dividend as well, so we have to be right clear on that. China, we've always said we have what I believe to be a mature relationship with China. That means that we can't tackle climate change unless China gets on board. But at the same time, we've been at the forefront of calling out the appalling situation of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. But at the same time, their influence over certain partners around the world is also clear. And there's again an argument, I alluded to earlier, about the prosperity horizon. The economic dividend we bring, it maybe speaks to Bob's point as well. We can make these cases, land these messages, but there has to be a return. And that's why when I talked of certain relationships with particularly the MENA region, it's how we actually look at that trading relationship as well of benefit, that we provide a real prosperity agenda, because that's what other players do.
Minister, thanks for coming before us today. Can I take you to Morocco, because that's, as some of you mentioned earlier in a question, that we have a strong relationship with Morocco. Many countries now have acknowledged and accepted Morocco's claim to sovereignty of the Western Sahara, but the UK still hasn't. And some of the excuses, if that's the right word, that we give is that of the issue with the Falklands and how that would look if we were to accept that Morocco's claim to sovereignty was a just and legitimate one. Recently, a professor of international law, Mark Weller, did a report where he says there is no legal equivalence between the claim of Morocco to the Western Sahara and perhaps Argentina's claim to the Falklands. So if that's the case and the Foreign Office would accept that, would that make a difference to the way that the UK looks at Morocco's claim to the Western Sahara?
First of all, with Morocco and, for that matter, Algeria, we have strong relations with both. I would describe them not just as strong, but very friendly, and I think that lends to a resolution on the whole question of Western Sahara. I do firmly believe the UK has an important and diplomatic role to play. The report you mentioned, I haven't read that yet. I know it's been it will make its way to my desk. I want to read it properly to be able to give you a more comprehensive result. But to me, it's an important contribution. So let's read it, assess it, and see what it says. But I do believe it comes back to perhaps a totally different situation when we were talking about Iran. I think the fact that we've kept a more nuanced and balanced position means that we've actually progressed well in our relations with both countries. But equally, we're very much behind Staffan de Misture's efforts. I'm regularly in touch with Staffan de Mistura, the UN envoy, on this particular issue to see how we can act. And again, it comes back to our convening power, discreetly in support of his efforts to bring the two sides together. It has to be resolved. And when we look at many of the disputes and conflicts around the world, I honestly believe, Royston speaking quite personally, I think this is one where we can move forward in a positive and constructive way. So in short, I do think there is a big role for the UK to play in convening, but working within the framework of the UN. And I'm speaking quite directly to Staffan de Mistura on this particular issue.
Thank you. Can I ask you then about our role as penholder in both Libya and in Yemen? Do you think we're doing enough in both of those countries when we've got a stalemate in Libya and worse in Yemen?
Libya in itself, I think, I go back to when I first entered Parliament, and I remember being on the backbenches and is getting a better understanding of why Libya happened when the whole removal of Gaddafi happened. Libya, the most important thing about Libya was its tribal influences. There were 36 tribes. Fabian will have good insight in this, I'm sure, as well. But they were the ones who were determining how Libya moved forward. I think it's tragic when you see 39% oil resources in Africa are in Libya. So it's not what I would call in need of humanitarian aid. It needs development, structured support, and again, I come back to that word prosperity agenda. But we need this intervention on the two warring sides. Yes, we're penholders, but there's been, even recently, SRSG Bathley, there was a bit of a fallout. He's no longer in position, so the UN envoy has been removed. I think there's some plans on the table, including the ones that are presented by the Egyptians, which I have been in discussions with the Egyptians. I think these need to be harnessed. I mean, there's because of what's happening in MENA, the focus within Israel-Palestine, the focus has changed. But I think, we need to, again, I wouldn't say that's as a conflict that can be resolved in the way that Western Sahara, but it does need that political impetus from the two sides to come together, and those, again, who have influence over them. And we're focused on that. I think the UN often says, well, what's the UN doing? The UN is only as good as its members. And I think we need to recognise that. And therefore, it's an onus on both. And it's for the UN to recognise which country has equity. And that brings me on to Yemen, actually. You mentioned about Yemen. Prior to the 7th of October, there's some good progress being made. And actually, again, talking of UK diplomacy, it was our diplomacy that bridged the gap between the United Nations and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the work they were doing with the Houthis to actually bring the two sides together. We've been investing in both. Libya, when the Derna flooding happened, we stepped up. We were there working with OCHA and other UN agencies. The same with the Houthis. We were working prior to the situation in Yemen with the engagement the Saudis were having with the Houthis, facilitating our development support through that channel. I recently, when I was in Riyadh for a meeting around the World Economic Forum, where we were meeting with all the foreign ministers, I purposely met with the Saudis, the UN envoy, and the Americans to see how we can take the momentum that we had until the end of last year and bring that to the fore again. The Houthis issue is a big issue, but we're engaging extensively with the government of Yemen, and I think this week both David and I are hosting the new Yemeni Prime Minister here in London. So, and again on Libya, we've been engaging. During Derna, I had a chat, extensive conversation, direct discussion, not in person, but over the phone with the Libyan president, the vice president I've met, their former foreign minister. But I would say again, the issue in Yemen, we've seen a slight reduction in recent weeks over what was happening in the Red Sea. I think that's come through pressure and indeed our Operation Prosperity with other countries, I would say including Bahrain, who are part of that formally, which has also helped send a message. But I think with Yemen, there is, again, I use that word, grasping the equities a country has. I think Saudis have a role to play. They're the bridge with the Houthis, and we're behind that particular effort. But we were the ones who brought the UN effectively into that, and we're dealing with all parties in that respect.
Are all parties on the same page? So if you look at the roadmap to peace, what happens in the event that the PLC signs up to that deal with the Houthis and the Saudis and the Emiratis and the rest? Who's going to guarantee their security in the event that a deal is done? Because even though a deal is done at government level, which is the same as in this country, doesn't mean everyone would agree with it. We only have to look at Brexit to see how it can be quite a divisive solution, even though it becomes the government's position. So how would we guarantee security for people in Yemen in the event that the roadmap makes its progress and a peace deal is signed after the coalition forces currently there, Saudis, Emiratis and others, would leave? What happens there?
I think there has to be regional guarantors to it, and that's why I think the Saudi role is extremely important behind that. And they're invested in it, not just in terms of their current operations. They're also investing in new facilities on the ground in Yemen in terms of operations in building hospitals, etc. So I think whilst we are supporting them directly, both through diplomatic efforts as well as through development support, they will be the sort of real guarantors of peace and security and bridging the gap between the Houthis and the government of Yemen, with whom we have a relationship. But it is a positive one, and whilst the UK won't be the lead player, we'll certainly have a role to play.
Bob?
19 Levant, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. How do you see the UK's role in developing? How do you see the UK's role developing in the Levant countries over the next decade?
Well, I think across the piece, when we look at the whole region, I think I come back to the fundamentals of what I've said before, that we need to invest in regional structures, regional partners, those countries that have influence across the region, and use our equities appropriately. I think the world is changing. It is much more dynamic. It is much more global, and our influences in those, we need to recognise the role. We can't resolve every issue. We can't resolve every crisis, but we do have a role to play.
Just looking at Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, just each of them briefly, please. Lebanon, I mean, it's a terrible condition as a country, heavily influenced by Hezbollah. So how do we deal with a country like that, and what does our relationship with Lebanon consist of right now?
Well, again, recent engagement, both the Foreign Secretary and I went to Lebanon, and we've had a footprint, you'll know this, since about 2009 in terms of supporting the Lebanese army in the north with Syria. We went to the various areas. We had a very constructive meeting with Prime Minister Mikati and also with General Aoun, the leader of the Lebanese army. There is some progress being made, firstly on the south with Hezbollah. You'll know where the Litani divide is as well. There's 13 points which were on discussion. I believe 7 have been addressed, so they've been resolved. There's 6 outstanding issues on the border that need to be resolved. But there is a sort of practical help in terms of support we're giving to the Lebanese directly.
Just on the Lebanese army front, do
Yeah.
you find, is it a force that could ever stand up to Hezbollah, or is it to what extent can it actually continue to develop as a coherent military force, which is the dominant military force in that country, over and above Hezbollah?
Well, sometimes you judge an organisation by the principal, and we met the principal in General Aoun, and he's a very dynamic general. He had some very clear ideas. When he asked for British support, he didn't ask for arms and weapons, he asked for uniforms. And that was direct because there are 5,000-6,000 people ready to be recruited into the Lebanese army. As I said, there is good progress being made by UNIFIL and some of the operations there, and progress on the direct issues of security in the south. And he had a clear plan on how they fill those Hezbollah positions and get Hezbollah to move north of the Litani. And of course, Hezbollah, as we know, is a recognised political party within Lebanon. So I'm not saying it's all big hope, but there are some practical things we're doing, and we have a role within there.
Great, thanks. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
No.
Thank you. Turning briefly to Syria, I mean, how on earth do we deal with a regime like Assad's when it is probably one of the largest sort of funders and suppliers of illicit drug dealing in the Middle East, if not the world, and given its appalling slaughter of its own people in the Syrian civil war?
First of all, we don't have diplomatic relations. You're right about the illicit trade. I mean, when you go to the borders of Jordan and you see the impact of Captagon, it's eye-watering, both in terms of the impact and the shocking nature of the billions it makes for the Assad regime. Again, it's demonstrable that he cares not about his own people. In terms of the conundrum around what Syria is, we have accountability mechanisms, but that as a country where the UK, I talked earlier, we've got to assess where we have best equity. At the moment, the best equity we have is in lending support to the Jordanians in terms of their challenge from our sanctions that we have at our disposal against Bashar Assad. The other thing we're watching very closely, and you would have seen it, is the kind of welcome back to the Arab League. But that's not a unified, warm welcome, all embracing. It's very different by each country. I don't know where that's going to be honest. Well, I'm not sure where that's going to be headed, but we have a lot of challenges on the ground. We touched briefly on extremism. Let's not forget also that Daesh is still very much there and present.
Just finally on Jordan, we have very sort of deep and fond ties with the Jordanians on lots of different levels. How stable is Jordan at the moment, and where is our relationship going with that country, and what is the thing that we are doing which is most valuable to us but also most valuable to the Jordanians?
I think the relationship is very strong. We've stood with Jordan. Our cooperation on Gaza has been exemplary. Prince Rashid, who leads their humanitarian effort, has been a constant partner in this respect. As you know, we did a lot of airdrops together with the coordination. So that's number one. On a bilateral basis, again, I alluded earlier, we're looking at their own investment climate, and we've recently had an inward visit by the investment minister. I'm hoping to go out in the next 2 weeks, both on the issue of Israel-Palestine, but also looking quite specifically on our bilateral relationship. And with King Abdullah, he's been a frequent visitor to the UK, and we're also in the midst of planning a Crown Prince visit here as well. And education would be the final point.
You're confident the Jordanian Royal Air Force will continue to shoot down any missiles that fly over their country from the Middle East?
Well, I think
from the Red Sea and Iran.
That the defence of their airspace is theirs, and any country has a right to protect its own airspace, and they will continue, I'm sure, to do so.
I'll have to move on, Bob, sorry, because the Minister's only got a couple of minutes and he's given us a bit longer anyway. A very small question from Dan, and then I think we'll wrap up.
Minister, what's your view of Israel's decision to ban Al Jazeera and of your media freedom in Israel at this point?
A very straight answer on that. We're strong supporters of media freedom, and I think it was the wrong decision to make.
Last one to Graham then.
Sorry, slightly off the area we've been talking about, but part of your responsibilities with the UN. Is there likely to be a vote on the UN's proposals for a pandemic agreement this week? And what is the UK's position on this? Because it would be transferring a lot of responsibility for decisions during an epidemic or a pandemic to the World Health Organization and away from the UK government.
You know, I need to get the full detail of this. I think one thing, though, I will speak from experience. I think we showed leadership when it came to the pandemic, the World Health Organization. We need to ensure that the parameters of working of any organization, we have influence over its governance, its direction, its policy, and we have a role to play. I think cooperation around the pandemic established new relationships, and our relationship with India was of great benefit to many millions. So, if I may, I'll come back to you on the specifics of that.
I'd be great. I'm sorry to spring you something.
No,
it wasn't, but if you could
right.
write to the committee and myself, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Lord Ahmed, Tariq, Stephen, team, thank you for your indulgence and for running over for us. We've covered as much as we could, but there's a lot more we couldn't have covered. We're very grateful to you, and we'll suspend the session at that. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.